Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Container ship leaves Ukrainian port of Odessa despite Russian threat of attack. Red Cross evacuates civilians from Kupian's front line. Plus, the Danish foreign minister urges China to speak up to Russia on Ukraine war. Thank you for joining us. The Russian Ministry of Defense says that its forces have now repelled multiple assaults from Ukraine in the directions of Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk, while Ukrainian armed forces announced progress in the directions of Melitopol and Berdyansk. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, its air defenses shut down a Ukrainian Su-25 fighter jet in Donetsk and intercepted 4 HIMARS missiles, 2 BM-30 missiles, and 26 unmanned aerial vehicles. Meanwhile, Ukrainian Armed Forces General Staff issued a report saying that offensive operations are still making progress in directions of Melitopol and Berdyansk over the past 24 hours. The report also said the Ukrainian Air Force conducted 7 strikes on Russian troops and equipment. Ukrainian multiple rocket launchers and artillery also hit Russian artillery, air defenses, and other important targets. Separately, Russia's Federal Security Services, FSB, said on Wednesday that a Ukrainian reconnaissance sabotage group attempting to enter the country's Bryansk Oblast was defeated and 4 members were killed. However, Ukraine's authorities have not yet commented. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that Russian strikes hit Ukrainian ports again overnight, almost 1 month to the day when Moscow pulled out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. In a televised address, President Volodymyr Zelensky said there have been 7 massive Russian attacks since Moscow abandoned the UN-backed deal allowing Ukraine to export grain. He said in his words, "Each Russian strike is a blow to world food prices, a blow to social and political stability in Africa, in Asia. No other terrorist in the world, apart from Russia, has ever so openly and intentionally targeted the security of so many nations at once." Russia has made regular airstrikes on Ukrainian ports and grain silos since mid-July and has threatened to treat any ships leaving Ukraine as potential military targets. Meanwhile, the United States has condemned Russia's continued attacks on Ukraine's grain infrastructure as it called for Moscow to return immediately to the grain deal. Speaking to reporters, U.S. State Department Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel said Russian President Vladimir Putin does not care about global food security.
I have one brief thing at the top, and then I'm happy to dive right into your questions. The United States condemns Russia's continued attacks on Ukrainian grain infrastructure and calls for Russia to immediately return to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Today, we are learning that multiple Russian drone attacks damaged warehouses and granaries in a Ukrainian port on the Danube near the Romanian border. Putin simply does not care about global food security. Such actions by the Kremlin negatively affect Ukrainian farmers and all those around the world who are most vulnerable to food insecurity. Russia's attacks on Ukrainian port infrastructure facilities have destroyed hundreds of thousands of Ukraine's grain bound for global markets. In the meantime, though, we're working with partners in Europe to identify other potential options to possibly find ways and corridors in which we can continue to get grain to the places it needs to go.
A ship left the Ukrainian Black Sea port of Odessa yesterday using what has been described as a new temporary corridor for merchant ships to and from its ports, which are blockaded by Russia. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Kobrakov posted pictures of the Hong Kong flagged Joseph Sholter on social media, saying the container ship carrying More than 30,000 metric tons departed with the tons of cargo in about 2,114 containers. Refinitiv Aecon graphics tracked the vessel leaving the port, and authorities said it was en route Istanbul. Ukraine last week announced a humanitarian corridor in the Black Sea to release cargo ships that have been trapped in its ports since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th, 2022. Moscow has not indicated whether it will respect the shipping corridor, and shipping and insurance sources have expressed concerns about safety. The Ukrainian Red Cross has transported civilians from several frontline towns in the Kupiansk district to safety as Kharkiv regional authorities earlier this month announced a mandatory evacuation. The Ukrainian armed forces have said for weeks that Russian troops were attacking their positions near Kupiansk, but that military defenses were holding up. For Oleh Yantisky and his partners Tatiana Nebeltsina, they left home in Kurilovivka, a few kilometers southeast of Kupiansk, because of daily shelling and skirmishes just outside the village. Ukrainian troops retook Kupiansk from Russia in September 2022. The small industrial town is a railway juncture and lies on the Oskil River. Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen says that he plans to ask China to take a stronger position on Ukraine and to speak to Russian President Vladimir Putin about the war. Speaking in Shanghai at the start of his three-day visit to China, Mr. Rasmussen said that Putin is not listening to European leaders, but is clearly listening to China, and that China shall speak up. The Danish Foreign Minister said he will discuss Ukraine and bilateral cooperation with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi when the two meet this week in Beijing.
Don't necessarily look eye to eye. Among them, most importantly, what's going on in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, where I think we need China to take a stronger position. Putin is not listening to European leaders, but he's clearly listened to China. So I want to argue that China should, speak up. Yeah, I'm going to meet the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Beijing Friday, and I will use that occasion to touch upon subjects as the war in Ukraine, but of course also things which actually bind us together. And I think that is what you expect of friends, that you speak openly also about these issues where you don't necessarily look eye to eye.
Now, let's talk to Mr. Alexei Haran, a political scientist specialist on international relations, professor of comparative politics, the Kiev Mohyla University, joining us from Kiev in Ukraine. Good morning and a warm welcome to the program.
Good morning, and I hope it will be a peaceful day, but everything may happen. There are no peaceful days in Ukraine right now. By the way, I'm happy to be back again to your program, and I like the title very much, Russian invasion. This is very, very important, Russian invasion. But then, in the subtitles, it's written Ukraine crisis. Guys, it's not Ukraine crisis, it's Russian invasion. Unfortunately, this is a war. And the war which was unseen in Europe since the end of World War II. This is a harsh reality. So I would prefer not to use the word Ukraine crisis, because that's the narrative which Russians are trying to impose. This is, something in Ukraine is going on. We have nothing to do with that. Okay, it's Russian invasion, right? It's Russian war against Ukraine. Thank you.
Indeed, a very good morning, and thank you for making out the time to join us. And you and me both, I do share that sentiment with you that you just expressed, that you will see better days in Ukraine as you're not seeing very good days now because of the war. As to the nomenclature of the program, Russian invasion, that's because that's exactly what it is. Whether they call it a special military occupation or not, I think the world is not wearing blinders and the world can see what's going on, whether or not they agree with them. So once again, Diakuyu, and thank you for being with us today.
Your Ukrainian is perfect.
I'm trying. Could we start with the latest counteroffensive and what we see happening, especially concerning the drone attacks and concerning the missile attacks from both sides? Are we at a point where there is still a stalemate, as has been expressed by all and sundry, or are the Ukrainians gaining an advantage, or are the Russians gaining an advantage? Because both sides seem to be making some progress.
Well, the answer, you need to look at the map, what's going on. So, and if you look at the map, you'll see that Ukrainians are moving forward, slowly but moving. How to put it? Look, yes, this is a counteroffensive from Ukrainian side, but compared to previous counteroffensive, which were quick, and Ukrainians were able to liberate lots of territories. Now it's going quite slowly, but it's understandable because Russians, they had time to prepare defense lines. And yes, they have strong defense. So we shouldn't say that, oh, it will be like, you know, it will be very, very quick. No, unfortunately, this is a war, as I said, it resembles World War II with all these trenches and mining and all these things. So yes, it's difficult to move, but Ukrainians are moving, and it seems that strategic aim of Ukrainians is to divide the Russian grouping in the south. So what is the situation right now? Just, you know, yesterday or yesterday basically, it was confirmed that Ukrainians took the small city, small town of Urozhaine in the south. But this is very important because if you look at the map, then you'll see that the distance from Urozhaine to the Black Sea is 80 kilometers. 80 kilometers. Definitely, again, it would not be easy. But now there is a threat, you know, to Russians to split their corridor, so-called corridor from occupied Donbass to Crimea. And this is, so we may say that Ukrainians have initiative right now. Is the situation in the, but again, I am not saying that tomorrow everything will be done. No, unfortunately, the moving is bloody and it involves a lot of resources. Near Bakhmut, the trick is that Russians seized Bakhmut, but now they are situated in the totally destroyed town. At the same time, Ukrainian army took the strategic heights around Bakhmut. So, and now they are destroying Russian troops in Bakhmut. Having said that, I would like also to say that Russians are trying to counterattack. And we see that the main threat of this, there are several places of counterattacks. The most serious right now, it seems to be near Kupiansk, which is at the north of the front line. And yeah, Russians moved a little bit there. So we are evacuating this city and the villages around for the safety of civilian population. According to military experts, I'm not a military expert, so I may rely on other experts from Ukraine, from the West, and even some writings of the Russians, because sometimes it's worthwhile to read what the enemy is saying. But it doesn't seem that Russians would be able to seize Kupiansk. So it will not change strategic situation at the front line. This attack, the danger is definitely, this is war. But the Russians do not have right now a lot of resources. to use them at different lines of the front. It's important for Russia, this counterattack near Kupiansk, because they would like, first of all, to withdraw Ukrainian resources from the south, and secondly, to have some symbolic gain. Because actually, during recent months, the Russians were in retreat. So for that, they need to have some symbolic gain. But again, from what I understand, there would be a harsh battle, first battle near Kupiansk, but it would be difficult for Russians to seize the city because they have many problems at other parts of the front line, and they do not have enough resources. So the Russian side is coming back to their traditional strategy to bomb Ukraine, to bomb civilians, to bomb infrastructure, to destroy grain in the southern ports of Ukraine. I would specifically like to talk about the grain issue. Can I?
Yes, indeed, you may. But before you do that, could we talk about the supply of weapons issue? Because we know that the prosecution of a war depends on the supply of weapons. For Ukraine, that has had to depend on the supply of weapons and military aid from allies such as the United States, it's predicated on the continuous supply of these weapons. And we've seen your president, Vladimir Zelensky, go on a whirlwind tour around many of the allies' countries, getting that aid from Germany, getting that aid from the UK, getting that aid from the United States, who I want to stay with for a second because the United States has a number of domestic challenges as we speak. There's the fentanyl crisis in the inner cities of Chicago and New York in the United States. There's the Maui wildfires in Hawaii. There's the southern border crisis with Mexico in the United States. President Joe Biden has asked the Senate to give them more funding for Ukraine, billions more than they are spending on their domestic issues. That, of course, is attracting criticism from the opponents of the Biden administration. Do you see this as a challenge if the war continues to be protracted, that the leaders in support of Ukraine will have challenges with the parliaments of their countries to continue to provide military funding for their aid to Ukraine?
Okay, thank you. Look, I'm historian, and I remember we may find a lot of excuses not to support the victim of aggression. And I'm historian. I know these cases, like the war in Spain, where the fascists were fighting Republicans in Spain, and the West declared non-interference policy. And how it ended? It ended that fascists actually, they won the victory in Spain, and then the fascism was spread throughout the whole Europe. We had Czechoslovakia, attack on Poland, and finally attack on the France and Britain, and finally the United States, who didn't want to join the war, had to do that. Okay, so the truth is that it's impossible to ignore the threat of what Russia is doing, because what Russia is doing right now is violation of every line of international law. And if you follow appeasement policy to Mr. Putin, which, by the way, this policy was conducted, I would say, by the West and the international community since 2008, the war in Georgia. First the war in Georgia, then Russian intervention in Syria, total destroyment of Aleppo, then seizure of Crimea, and so on and so forth. So if we ignore it, then we see that aggressor will move further and further. That's why there is a decision to support Ukraine. And I'm very thankful to all the countries which are supporting Ukraine. So let's talk about Nigeria. You do not provide military support to us, but you are voting for Ukrainian territorial integrity and withdrawal of Russian troops in the United Nations, and you're voting for that on a permanent basis, and we are very thankful for that. Now, regarding the domestic pressure in the countries which are supporting Ukraine, yes, you know that these countries are democratic, and when you have democracy, you have different voices, you have different interpretations. It's not like dictatorship as in Russia, right? Where Putin decided to start this crazy war, which is counterproductive to Russian interests. Russians are dying. What for? So democracy has another, setting. So yes, there is a debate, there is an influence of domestic issues, there is an influence of electoral campaign. So what we are living with, so Ukraine is fighting for the second year. There were different elections in different countries, and there were voices that, oh, it will change the position. Let's take Italy, where elections brought to power right-wing government, and there were a lot of doubts that Meloni, new prime minister of Italy, would support Ukraine, but she's very staunch in supporting Ukraine. So regarding America, the US, that's definitely, electoral campaign will influence that. Luckily for Ukraine, we have a bipartisan support for Ukraine in the American chamber. However, you are right that there are part of Republicans who are saying, no, we are spending too much on Ukraine, we need to concentrate on domestic issues, and I would say the main issue still remains Trump. Because it's a paradox, because it was under Trump when Ukraine first received javelins, anti-tank complexes. Not good thing. So this was the first weapons which were provided to Ukraine in 2017. Only javelins. Right, but it was done under Trump. But then we heard a lot of, different statements from Trump, how he will do with this war. Now he's saying that I would end the war in a day. How you will manage to do that? So he was saying that I will promise money to Putin and I will not promise money to Zelensky. So that's how I will make them to move closer. These statements are not serious, very, very populist. So, but definitely it will influence.
Finally, Professor.
So
finally, Professor.
I think what is important also now is to work with not only with Democrats but also with Republicans, and to explain to them. A lot of Republicans, they do understand what's going on, that Ukraine needs support. With newcomers, it's important to work and to explain to them what's really going on in Ukraine and what atrocities Russians are doing, which are dangerous for the whole world. And here we may come to grain issue.
Yes, we may come to it. You know that your president and the Ukrainian government has promised insurance for the farmers who have been commended for their hardiness and their bravery in continuing to take the farm produce from the fields to the silos and the storehouses. Can you give us an update on that? Because we know that these silos are soft targets for the Russians, and they're taking advantage of it by bombing and attacking the warehouses.
Yeah, look, the sound is not very good, so your questions were not was not very, very clear. But I think I got the main point you mentioned. Yes, Russians continuing to attack the infrastructure connected to the grain export. Grain export from Ukraine, and here. Frankly speaking, I think that this is totally destructive to the image of Russia, because everybody in the world can see who left Black Sea grain deal, who decided not to promote it, and moreover, who is attacking and destroying Ukrainian Ukrainian export of grain. So the whole world now sees the videos of bombardment and of Ukrainian grain infrastructure. And I believe that, again, I see Ukrainian crisis and it diverts my attention. But everybody in the world now can see what Russia is really doing and the threat of more starvation in the world, including in Africa. So here I think this is one more sphere where the countries of the so-called global south may unite their forces together with other international partners to secure the import of grain from Ukraine. And look, in principle, yeah, it was good that we had this Black Sea grain deal. But from formal point of view, there is a more basic international principle, which is called freedom of navigation, right? Freedom of navigation for civilian ships. So basically, if the Russian side respects the freedom of navigation, there should be no need in signing any other agreements, right?
Okay.
But they violated the freedom of navigation. So there was a kind of this compromise, Black Sea grain deal. Now Russia violated this compromise, but the basic principle is they are violating the freedom of navigation for civil ships. So
ships. We'll have to leave it there. We'll have to leave it there, Professor.
And I believe you mentioned in your introduction that
Professor,
there
we'll have
was
to
a
leave it
ship
there.
which now passed.
Yes, yes. There's a ship that was passed, and we understand there are about 60 more ships, civilian ships, that are trapped in the NATO ports, excuse me, the Ukrainian ports, which seek passage, for which Ukraine say they want to provide a humanitarian corridor. But that's as far as we can go because of the purposes of time. But we do thank you for your insights, and your contribution this morning is very much appreciated. Professor Alexei Haran, political science specialist on international relations, professor of comparative politics, Kiev Mohyla University, joining us from Kiev in Ukraine. Many thanks.
Thank you for your coverage, very balanced coverage of Russian war against Ukraine.
Thank you. After the break, U.S. says there are no clear threats to NATO from Wagner forces. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. You are in the sophomore stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. The United States says it is not clear what territorial threat Wagner forces pose in Europe. Asked about the movement of Wagner Group's forces, National Security spokesperson John Kirby said some contingents remain deployed in Africa, here. Some went to Belarus, and some could still be in or near Ukraine. He added that the U.S. government is taking note of the provocative actions out of Belarus.
We are watching what's going on in Belarus very, very closely. Certainly taking note of some of the provocative actions there, and certainly the bellicose, pugilistic rhetoric that continues to come out of the government there in Belarus. All I can tell you is that we're in constant contact with our NATO allies, particularly on the eastern flank. We understand the concern. We share the concern. And the only other thing I'd say is that nothing has changed at all about our commitment to defend our NATO allies and defend every inch of NATO territory should it come to that. So we're watching this very closely, and we're certainly in close contact with our Polish allies, who we know this is not some rhetorical exercise for them. It's real for them. They live with that every single day, and we respect that. We understand that. But make no mistake that we're serious about our Article 5 commitment. And that's a segue to the other question you had, which is about additional force. So I don't have certainly any troop announcements to make today or anything like that. As you've seen, President Biden has already increased by some 20,000 the American troop presence in NATO, particularly on the eastern flank. And he has put in place processes where we can keep that presence there for the long haul. Rotational, but that they'll be able to stay. So we're up around 100,000 troops in the European theater right now, which is the most in many, many years since the Cold War. So the Wagner threat from Belarus, again, we're watching this closely. It's not really clear exactly where all the Wagner guys are. We know some of them went to Belarus. We know some of them went to Africa. We believe that there's probably some contingents that are either still in Ukraine or close by. But we're not exactly clear what the numbers are, and it's not clear to us what legitimate territorial threat they pose, at least in Europe. They continue to pose a significant concern on the African continent by the way they continue to destabilize governments there, support terrorists, and that kind of thing. But we're watching this as closely as we can. Again, all I can tell you is we take it seriously. We listen to what's coming out of Minsk. We're certainly mindful of the movement. We certainly are mindful of these recent events. But we're not. We haven't moved anything as a result. And you know, if we need to do that, certainly we could. We take it seriously. Yeah.
Taking my question.
Meanwhile, Lithuania said it will close 2 of the country's 6 border crossing points with Belarus because the geopolitical environment has become more threatening, just weeks after Russian Wagner Group mercenaries took refuge in the neighboring country. Lithuania announced that the 2 rural crossing points, which were not used by commercial vehicles, will be closed from Friday. Poland has closed all but 1 border crossing point with Belarus this year, following the imprisonment of a journalist of Polish origin and expulsions of Polish diplomats, and last week announced plans to move 10,000 additional troops to the Belarus border to support existing guards. The country said in July it had concerns that the presence of Wagner fighters in Belarus could lead to increased tension on the border. Let's talk now to Dr. Kunle Olawumi, retired Navy Commodore, head of the Department of International Relations and Diplomatic Studies, Crystal University, Abeokuta. Welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Navy Commodore, the National Security Spokesperson of the U.S., John Kirby, seems to be echoing a logical train of thought, saying that it's not clear what threats the Wagner mercenary group could pose to Europe. If you remember, at the beginning of the what they called the uprising, what they called the mutiny of the Wagner forces, there was even talk that Prigozhin, Yevgeny, had ambitions of taking over Russia by way of a coup, and some went as far as to call it a coup. That, of course, is a preposterous idea, knowing the iron fist with which Putin rules Russia and his inner circle, and how difficult it will be to even command any sort of support from anyone to so much as conduct a coup in Russia. But that's part of the propaganda. So what do you make of Poland's reactions to the Wagner mercenary groups? Is this making the mountain of a molehill, or are they indeed a threat? Also, sorry, for your information, the Wagner mercenary group has been registered in Belarus as a limited liability company for educational purposes by Alexander Lukashenko.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I'm smiling because I'm enjoying the game, you know. This is a chess game, and it started since 2014 when the NATO forces, you know, played the first piece on the board. And after that, you know, the Russians reacted, and it's been a very complex war game, but I'm enjoying it because I can almost predict what the game is all about. The move the Russians made, by staging a coup and moving the Wagner group to Belarus. I said on this program once that it's like a gambit game. That coup was a ruse. A lot of people don't believe me, but this move is very strategic because this is a queen move on the chessboard. I'm enjoying it because it has actually achieved its objective, which is increasing the ambiguity. NATO are confused now. You had the spokesperson saying they don't even really understand what the Wagner groups are doing. The ambiguity is that the Wagner group will attack, maybe some areas in those front lines of Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and perhaps maybe carry out some probing attacks in Poland. But I think what is more plausible to me in this game is that the Wagner group are actually positioned there to attack Kiev. I said it once, and some people feel it's not the case. Some people even feel that the coup was real. But I'm enjoying it because now the NATO are in dilemma now as to what the real intention of the game master is. For me, Wagner will not attack Poland because that would be a stupid move by Putin if he decides at this point to attack Poland. It's going to escalate beyond reasonable doubt, and it's not going to be a wise move by Putin. In this kind of game of chess, the game masters are not really going for the king, and that's what is different from the actual war, the theater operations, and a game of chess. Your intention may be in a game of chess to capture the king, but in this game, it's going to likely end in stalemate. The Wagner group will not enter Poland. Once you do, then you trigger the Third World War, which I think is not in the interest of Russia, which I think is not in the interest of NATO. It may be convenient for the United States because it's not within their border area. But I don't think the Europeans will be happy if Wagner group attack Poland, thereby, activating Article 5 of the NATO treaty. So I don't think anybody is going to make that mistake among the two players, that's the United States and Putin. They should anticipate, as I said earlier in this program, that Wagner Group may likely be used more in Kiev than in Poland. And for the African aspect of it, of course, they need a lot of resources, to prosecute that war. So Wagner will be doing a lot of stealing in Africa so that Putin can have enough resources to fight this war.
Your chess analogy is useful. I'm more of a draft guy, but we know that it is not a game. And if we talk about battle strategy and battle plans and the battle execution going on by the Ukrainians and the Russians at the front lines, then maybe we'll have another look at how successful both sides are. For instance, as they play this game of chess, as they move these men up and down, lives are being lost, and that's why it's good to be conciliatory, to try and find a middle ground so both sides can come back to the negotiating table. But to the prosecution of the war at the front lines, some analysts have said that the Ukrainians, obviously with the benefit of the expertise of military commanders around the world, have been very smart with the way they're trying to pull out the Russians from the areas in which they're concentrated behind their mines. So they're saying that they attack them in certain areas for the Russians to leave other areas to try and defend themselves in that area. And then when they've exhausted their defense, then the Ukrainians attack them from another area. And that's why the Ukrainian counter-offensive has been slow, that it has been deliberately slow on the part of the Ukrainians so as to draw out the war, so as to stretch out the Russian fighters, that they may have an inroad? What's your opinion?
Yeah, actually, I listened to an Ukrainian soldier a few minutes ago. He wasn't very happy that they are being criticized, about their slow movements on the battlefield, There's no way you can actually fly over those mines. I said on this program before that the Ukrainians should just leave those mines alone and conduct a maneuverage approach. They have been bogged down there. They kept on losing men, materials, and it is convenient actually for Putin, and it's also convenient for the United States. The longer this war, goes on, the better for them. What a lot of pundits may not realize is that outside the battle zone that we are seeing, a lot of wars are going on. If you look at what is happening in the Scandinavian countries, Finland, Norway, Sweden, even Netherlands, that's another area that we are not paying attention to. And if you look at what the Americans are doing in Guam, as of yesterday, they are putting so much missiles and interceptors in Guam. Guam is actually in the south of China and also in the east of Manila. And people are not saying that, what is happening in Ukraine itself, as you are talking about the tactics. I'm not very comfortable discussing tactics because, in war, so those things you are seeing as tactics, they are just series of battles, pockets of battles here and there. And it does not really speak about what is really the objective of that war. The tactics by the Ukrainians are adopting has been criticized by NATO and the West, by and large. But, you have to also see how they are coping with the new equipments they are taking. Some of these equipments, they are not really used to them. The tactics that those equipments are supposed to be applied, it's not something you can learn in 6 weeks, So it's easy to sit down in an office, as I do, and criticize what the Ukrainians are doing. They are doing their best, but they're not looking at the big picture, the strategy. What is the objective? Is the objective to just take the Donbass? They should expand their objective beyond Donbass. I expected the Ukrainians now to be hitting some strategic areas inside Russia. I don't know, I didn't want to say this, but I was wondering what they've been waiting for. They should diversify their plans. Plan B, what is their plan B? What is their plan C? Why should you bog down? Why should you make Donbass your objective, your sole objective? Even if you get it, that Donbass region, you still have Crimea to contend with. You have the Black Sea to contend with. So they should be very flexible in their tactics. As I said, I don't feel comfortable discussing tactics except you're in the battle zone. And then you can really feel what is going on there. But I think they should diversify. They should leave that Donbass region that is so well defended. The kind of defense that the Russians have put in that place is going to be very grinding. I mean, we are going back to First World War, Second World War, where you line up people and you fight a battle of attrition. This is not Second World War. This is not First World War. Ukrainians should change tactics. They should be flexible in their strategy. They should hit Russia where it pains them most, inside Russia, so that they can also look back and try to diversify. Look at what the Russians are doing to the Europeans. They keep on, diversifying their approach. Look at now, they're in dilemma as to why what is the Wagner, what are they doing there? The NATO group should also advise the Ukrainian fighters to avoid war of attrition where they're going to lose so much equipment and men, and try to seek an alternative objective. Flexibility is one of the, point that you have to take, in war. You have to be flexible.
Okay, Navy Commodore, having served in that capacity, you have an understanding of maritime warfare. is there a danger that Ukraine will be provoking the naval fleets of Russia to go on a more concerted attack against them, because they have not stayed away from the Black Sea? They have also attacked using underwater drones some of the Russian ships. They have also said that a civilian ship should be able to have sailed forth out of a Ukrainian port, and they have also promised a Ukrainian humanitarian corridor, regardless of the Russian blockade of the Black Sea. Is any danger existing that Ukraine is going to provoke Russia to begin to actually use its warships? But we understand that Ukraine's warships capacity is negligible compared to the Russians.
Yeah, absolutely, you're right. That would be a red flag. Both sides, the NATO forces, Turkey, and some of those frontline states, they know it's going to be a red flag. The Russians are very, very strong. They are stronger at sea. And to provoke a naval battle at the Black Sea is going to mess up that entire region. It's going to affect Turkey, Georgia. It's going to affect some other countries, even that are far, Kazakhstan and so on. They're going to tread very carefully not to provoke a maritime warfare with Russia. They are very strong. They are very strong in that area. And I think they should try to see how they can negotiate their way out of an explosive affair in the Black Sea. That's a red flag. They shouldn't go there. I've seen the way their ships, the grain ships, left about 3 days ago through the corridor. And I think you can't be too sure. How do you draw the lines? Within the Black Sea. How do you ensure that they are within limits? Are you talking about the territorial waters, 12 nautical miles from the baseline? Are you talking about the 2 nautical miles? Are you talking about 24 nautical miles? You have to be careful, because the ceiling of communications can be a bit fluid. Weather can take your ship off course, instruments can take your ship off course. And when you have the kind of powers that the Black Sea fleet has, then I think it's an area the allies should avoid. They should tread carefully not to provoke Russia into a maritime warfare.
Finally, do you think that Ukraine should build up its naval capacity? And why are battleships so expensive? We understand that Russia right now is the biggest naval superpower, that they have more ships than anybody else, and the United States is trying to play catch-up with China, who have about 400 battleships, and the United States over 200 battleships, not to talk of the other ones that have significantly less. Why is it so expensive compared to maybe air power?
Yeah, on to people, people, they see me as a commodore, but I discuss some of these things. The training for maritime operations is total. I can operate in the air, land, amphibious. So it is very expensive to train naval officers, and their equipment are also total. We have landing ship craft, we have special forces that can operate from sea to land. The equipments are huge. When I was commanding a combatant 3, I was carrying missiles, the automatic missiles, that each of them cost as much as 500 million. And if you want to use one, you have to be very careful to see the cost benefits. You have to do cost benefit analysis. If you want to produce a warship today, it's going to take minimum, even if you fast track it, it's going to take, depending on the class, whether it's a frigate, a destroyer, an aircraft carrier, maybe even submarines. If you're going to build submarines or warships, it takes time, 1 year, 2 years, sometimes 36 months. And it's not just to build the warships, you need to train men. I was carrying about 78 men on board a small combatant frigate, FPB, we call them. Each of them has to have specializations, marine, electrical electronics, weapons, navigation and direction, communication signals, even we call landing team and body
Maybe,
team.
Commodore, we're going to have to interrupt you there. So sorry, so sorry. I was really listening to you, and I'm sure all our viewers are as well. Welcome to the final stretch, and finally, a father and son who fight in the same Ukrainian brigade took part in firing drills in southeastern area on Wednesday alongside dozens of other soldiers. 56-year-old Vladimir and 26-year-old Denis came from Ukraine's Dnipro, where they used to work shoulder to shoulder in the logistics business, transporting construction material when full-fledged war broke out in Ukraine in February 2022. The two were enrolled in the same territorial defense brigade. Speaking after a drill simulating the capture of enemy positions, both father and son say they were trying to live as one family, covering and looking out for each other on the battlefield. And that's where we will leave it for today's Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching. Thank you to our guests as well and our producers. Have a good day. Do join us again tomorrow.